Miami Hurricanes have an important weekend coming up of official visits in the transfer portal, and some new transfer portal targets are emerging.
You are Locked On Canes, your daily podcast on the Miami Hurricanes, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I am Alex Donno, University of Miami alumnus, longtime South Florida sports radio vet, and also host of Locked On ACC. Thank you so much to the everydayers for making Locked On Canes your first listen and your first watch, or in this case, maybe your second listen and your second watch. So much going on. We had to do another episode today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And we're bringing out the big guns. Our good friend, Brad Tejeda. We love talking transfer portal and recruiting with BT from CanesInsight.com. So, Brad, I want to start with Damien Martinez, who's been Miami's number one transfer portal target since the day he officially hit the portal. Martinez is coming in for an official visit, headlining a cool list of visitors. There are others coming in this weekend. Is Miami the team to beat here for Martinez? I think the answer to that is yes, but how likely do you think this one is?
Yeah, what's up, Alex, man? Appreciate you always having me on talking Canes football with the fans. Yeah, we kind of knew from the jump with this Damien Martinez thing, bringing Cam Ward on board and seeing him in person during the spring game. We kind of knew where the chips fell. This is a season where we could potentially be all in, and with the pieces we bring in together, I think it was pretty obvious coming after that spring game that we still needed that dominant presence in the running back room, right? You had all these other guys that transferred elsewhere, and you kind of are left with guys that are coming off of injury, and you don't necessarily know what's going to happen in the future. Damien Martinez was at the top of the board, right? And when he started out these 5 potential visits for Damien, right, he ended up canceling Tennessee, went in home with Miami, with the running back coach, obviously, before all of these visits began. And then obviously with the timeline, he visited Arizona and Mississippi State before canceling another visit on his board with Kentucky, right? And after canceling that visit, he had another in-home visit with Miami. So, you started out with 5 visits, you canceled 2, and you're down to Miami left with this weekend coming up. And from everything I've heard, man, we're gearing up for hopefully a big weekend. Him and the family should be here for at least 2 to 3 days. And there's some other guys that will be joining him as well. So I'm hoping for hopefully multiple commits for the Miami Hurricanes. But at the end of the day, man, adding a guy like Damien Martinez, who is easily probably the top running back in the transfer portal, one of the top running backs in college football last year. This is a guy that ran for 1,800 yards almost last season. You talk about rivals in Florida State and Florida that may have to face this guy. Just to put it in perspective, if Damien Martinez ended up going to a team like Florida, for instance, they wouldn't have a running back like that since 2004 was the last time they had a running back rush for the amount of yards that Damien Martinez ran for last year. So this is a guy that we are definitely going to want come August 31st.
And we mentioned other visitors are expected. Sam Brown, the wide receiver from Houston, cornerback Dyoni Hill from Marshall, and I think Jaylin Alderman, the linebacker from Louisville, might visit as well. But before we talk about some of those guys, let's talk about a fresh name that just came into Miami's news cycle earlier today, Brad. And this one shocked me a little bit. Let me give you some background, right? Because I admit when I sometimes get things wrong or potentially get things wrong, because people have been asking me in recent days, like, hey, is Miami going to try to bring in 2 running backs like Damien Martinez and someone else? And my answer has been, I don't see it. Like, with limited roster spots and other positions of need, I don't see why you would try to bring in more running backs. And I don't know how serious Miami is about this. Let me just say that off the bat. But a video piece that came out from 24/7 Sports on Tuesday afternoon, Andrew Ivins, who used to cover Miami, he's a national recruiting guy now. He mentioned with Colorado running back Dylan Edwards, very, very different player than Damien Martinez, by the way. So there could be a complementary factor here. But with Dylan Edwards now in the transfer portal, Andrew Ivins starts talking about how he thinks Ole Miss and Miami could be the teams to watch there because they're both trying to go all in the portal. So I'm like, I'm still trying to wrap my head around this idea of Martinez. Absolutely. I'm trying to wrap my head around the idea of bringing in another running back, as different as he might be, because Dylan Edwards is not nearly as powerful as Martinez, speedster who can also line up in the slot, line up at receiver. So would fill kind of a different need, but still, I kind of would view that as a potential luxury pickup. Like, how serious do you think Miami could be with Dylan Edwards?
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. That was a pretty big bomb that they dropped earlier today, man. Between Coop and Andrew chiming in with the Dylan Edwards news, I'm gonna be honest. I mean, anyone that follows me on Twitter and from time to time, I'll pop into Twitter Spaces and kind of give my 2 cents. I was always kind of skeptical on the opposite side as you of possibly bringing in 2 running backs. Looking at the running backs that I said earlier that left the program, you were kind of left with Jai Allen and Mark Fletcher, and the rest of the guys are guys that never played college football before, right? And the guys that you're relying on are both guys that have battled through injuries or are currently injured. So in my opinion, I think, best case scenario would be to possibly, let Mark Fletcher heal up as long as possible and maybe bring in another guy to where, you could not have to rely on a Jai Allen or Chris Johnson Jr., for instance, that, may have to only be in particular situations instead of relying on key situations. You could bring in someone that has already been in those situations, played college football, and has a very similar skill set to a Chris Johnson, to a guy prior that was at Miami and Brashard Smith. I think Dylan Edwards would be a huge home run, a guy that not only could bring an element to the offense side of the ball, but then would be a key piece in the returning game as well. You mentioned Ole Miss and Miami like they did as well, but I think Kansas State and Nebraska are also 2 other teams to look out for, in my opinion. I am pretty shocked that Miami is linked to Dylan Edwards out of all people. I was more of the guy that, hey, you're going to get your number one guy in Damien Martinez, and maybe if you do go after second running back, it'll probably be someone that was leading rusher in the MAC conference or something that you get later in the portal. But I do think it wouldn't be a bad get to possibly get another running back. But if I had to pin a certain position that I really do think Miami needs to focus on, that just there hasn't been too many options right now currently in the portal, is a backup center. I think we do need to look into maybe possible backup center to push Zach Carpenter at that starting position. And to where, as we know, football injuries do happen, and you got to make sure that next man up is someone that could come in right away and not, deplete that offensive line that we've been building the last 2 years.
Yeah, and I want to talk about defensive tackles and wondering if a new option has emerged, because as we've been telling people, hey, the portal's not done. Like, there are still going to be players who have entered, and there's a few new targets. A potential defensive tackle option just entered the portal. A potential defensive end option entered. Another cornerback option is out there. So we'll talk about all this. We got Brad Tejeda from Canes Insight with us. My friends, you want to keep it locked right here on this brand new episode of Locked On Canes. And I know you're keeping it locked to FanDuel. This is the time to sign up. FanDuel Sportsbook. My friends, it's playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball's in full swing. FanDuel, it's your place to bet on every game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. Bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. I love those player props. I love those over-unders, spreads, money line, whatever you want. They got it at FanDuel. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. And we are also proudly brought to you by Monopoly Go. My friends, I need you all to listen up for a huge announcement. I have been tracking the leaderboards every day, keeping my eye on the scores, putting all my heart into it, and I'm super pumped to announce I am finally on top. That's right. Obviously, I'm talking about the hit mobile game Monopoly Go. You've probably heard of it. It's been downloaded over 150 million times. It's a great mobile twist on classic Monopoly. You can play anywhere, anytime. You explore hundreds of Monopoly boards from Las Vegas to Camelot to the moon. They don't have Tallahassee on there, by the way, while raking in a huge fortune. Charge rent on iconic properties just like classic Monopoly, or you could charge your friends rent on your iconic properties, or go after their Monopoly money by pulling bank heists and wrecking their landmarks with wrecking balls. But my favorite part is the leaderboards. You can see who's a Monopoly tycoon and who's gone bankrupt. So get yourself on the charts. Download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store and Google Play. Thank you so much for making this episode of Locked On Canes your second listen and your second watch today. We're back for the second time today. Brad Tejeda from Canes Insight is with us. So Brad, we've talked on Locked On Canes the last few days about Simeon Barrow, the defensive tackle from Michigan State, arguably their best defensive player for the past couple of years. I don't like the way Miami's been trending there because I think LSU has been trending very strongly for Barrow, but he's got a teammate in the portal now, defensive tackle Derrick Harmon from Michigan State. Could this be an option for the U?
Yeah, last time we spoke here on Locked On, two of the defensive tackles we mentioned was Simeon Barrow from Michigan State, who you mentioned, possibly looks like he's LSU bound. And the other guy we mentioned was CJ West out of Kent State, who we thought was going to end up visiting LSU, this weekend. And his visit got pushed back because of Simeon Barrow. So we'll see what happens with CJ West. I wouldn't count that out 100%. But I also wouldn't lean toward Miami being the favorite. But then you mentioned Barrow's teammate, Derrick Harmon. This is a guy that, had 25 games under his belt, 71 tackles, 6.5 tackles for a loss, and I think 3.5 sacks. He's 6'5", 320 pounds. And, when you talk about, from a physique standpoint, productive standpoint, this is a guy that you definitely want to bring in. We talk about how the portal, it gives and it takes. And just in the last 48 hours, we saw guys like Jaden Wayne and Harrison Hunt leave the program. So you need to make sure that you continue to bring guys in that could either push the room or to be an instant impact guy. And I do like where Mario has been going with the transfer portal. It seems like he's a little bit ahead of the curve. I mentioned Jaden Wayne and Harrison Hunt. Jaden Wayne, you got guys like Cole McConaughey, Malik Bryant, and Marquise Lightfoot that are really pushing for reps over Jaden Wayne. So you don't have to worry too much about someone leaving the program and figuring out, is someone going to be able to fill his spot? And then you talk about Harrison Hunt. We didn't necessarily think he would leave the program, but when you bring in guys like Marley Cook and CJ Clark and possibly bringing in another transfer portal at the same position, you got to think, someone like Hunt may want to just go elsewhere and seek hopefully being a starter and getting more playing time somewhere else. But at the end of the day, man, I think Derrick Harmon, he could be a name to possibly watch. I know there's a few other teams in the mix for him. But there's also another guy at the defensive line position, not at the tackle, but at the end, and Tyler Barron out of Tennessee. He was a former Ole Miss commit and I believe a former Louisville commit. So he's gotten a lot of NIL money from a few programs. And I know that program up in Kentucky and Louisville is hurting for money. So I don't expect those guys to have any money anytime soon to not only get players, but to keep them, as you can see in the transfer portal. It's been working for them. But I think Tyler Barron, out of the names that you're watching at the defensive line position, he's probably the most interesting out of Tennessee that I would watch for, that Miami could possibly look at. He could definitely be a rotational piece to come in and help, fill in that spot. You lose a guy like Nigel Kelly as well, that's possibly going to switch and go to a SEC program, which is going to be good for him as well. So, best wishes for the guy that's leaving, but we got to bring in some quality guys as well. So I like where we stand with some of these guys. If you can land about 4 of these names that we've, brought up today, I think we're in a good place.
How do you feel about the search for defensive backs? Some of these names we've talked about on Locked On Canes. One of these we haven't, because cornerback Terrence Brooks from Texas is a very recent transfer portal entry, but we have talked about Dyoni Hill, who's visiting this weekend. We have talked about Anthony Johnson Jr. We also did bring up Snacks Johnson from Arkansas. We'll see if Miami can become a contender for him. But do you think is Dyoni Hill, is that the one Miami's trending strongest for? How do you think that can play out?
Yeah, the Dyoni Hill's locally from Gainesville, Florida, right here in my backyard. And
I didn't realize that.
Yep, he's also, coming from Marshall, as you know, he was once under Lance Guidry and coached by Chevis Jackson, who are both, coaches at Miami as well. So you gotta think that plays a big part in this recruiting weekend for Dyoni Hill, and the fact that he's coming here this weekend with Damien Martinez and possibly Sam Brown and others. It's kind of gearing up to it kind of feels like a big time recruiting weekend again, right? Where you're bringing some of those big pieces that you expect to be the dominoes for your recruiting class. It seems like we're doing the same thing for the transfer portal, which is what you like to see. So it seems like we're all in on a few of these guys, and I like where we're going with the direction, and I'm excited for what the future holds with the Canes this year.
And Sam Brown, the receiver who's visiting from Houston. So he's got the history with Shannon Dawson. Dawson was his OC a couple of years ago. He also seems to have a relationship with Cam Ward because they were throwing together last week. I think that was back in Texas. So there seems to be something brewing there with Brown. Is Miami the team to beat there?
again, it goes back to relationships, right? It seems like all these transfer portal guys that we've mentioned today that we seem very confident will probably be Canes, and all seem to probably going to visit this weekend, whether it's Damien Martinez having a relationship with his agent, first round management local in South Florida. You got Sam Brown, who has a relationship with Coach Donaldson, and like you mentioned, with Cam Ward as well. Dyoni Hill, relations with Coach Guidry and Coach Jackson. And then Jaylin Alderman, the linebacker out of Louisville, who's a 13-game starter with 58 tackles for a loss. Again, relationships, was once coached under Derek Nicholson as well. So it goes all back to, it seems like these guys might not necessarily, when you put the logo and with the stats next to them, isn't the number one target at the position, but it goes back to needs and what fits your puzzle. And like Coach Field tweeted earlier today, man, you got to get the right pieces to the puzzle. And it seems like we're gearing up to do that this weekend.
Great stuff as always from Brad Tejeda, and he and D Money, Peter Reeves are doing awesome work at canesinsight.com. I appreciate the grind that you guys put on. Brad, thank you so much for the time, and hopefully a good portal weekend coming up.
Yes, sir. Thank you as much, man. Go Canes.
We will talk to everybody next time on another episode. Oh, we'll have Larry Bluestein on tomorrow, by the way, so we're going to keep rocking and rolling. We'll talk to you guys next time on another episode of Locked On Canes, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.